She works as a clinician with both girls and boys with a range of presentations, complex mental health diagnosis, trauma, and delinquent behaviors. And her work has included training staff, clinicians, and administrators, as well as developing curriculum to support the work from a relational model. So Sally, welcome. Really wonderful to have you here. I think what I'll do is I'll take a moment to also just introduce David Prescott as well, who is one of our expert panelists, and he's the clinical director of the Beckett family of services. And he has authored and edited numerous articles and books on the assessment treatment of people who have sexual abuse of all ages. And he's the past president of ATSA, the Association for the Treatment of Sexual Abusers, and a member of the Motivational Interviewing Network of Trainers. He's also co-editor of the NEARI newsletter with Steve and I, and also is the review editor for the ATSA forum. And he serves on the International Advisory Board for the Journal of Sexual Aggression. And just say that he has provided trainings from around the world. And Steve Benjis is also co-editor of a NEARI newsletter. He also has provided trainings around the world, and he is also the executive director of NEARI and NEARI Press. And Steve has been working in the field for many years and co-founded NEARI with his wife Penny, who you'll be able to hear in a webinar next month. So I think without further ado, I am going to turn this over to Sally. And Sally, just will have a chance to give you a little bit of an overview of Stephen, who is the case that she's presenting. And again, all the identifying information has been changed. So Sally, I'm turning this over to you now.
Okay, thank you. And I'm glad to be here. So to begin, I want to give you a little introduction to Stephen. Stephen is 9 years old. He is of Eastern European descent. He's in the legal custody of his mother, and he was adopted at age 5. Stephen has a multitude of vulnerabilities. As I said, he was adopted. He lived in an orphanage from age 2 weeks to age 5.5. He was born without an anus, without a penis, with club feet and multiple cardiac anomalies. He has had multiple surgeries both pre and post adoption and has more scheduled. Stephen is an incredibly resilient, engaging, athletic, charming, adventuresome little guy. I actually can't say enough about his strengths and his resiliency. The referral concern was Stephen was presenting with significant aggression, sexualized behavior, homicidal ideation, and self-harm. His family of origin is also very complex, and I think as this continues, more issues will be brought up. But his birth mother did have a history of drug abuse. She died at age 35. It is thought that this was from an overdose. The father also had a drug history. He was murdered while incarcerated. Stephen has siblings who have a history of incarceration and developmental delays. He has a possible twin. He identified a young woman that came in, a little girl that came into the orphanage as his twin and only brought it up recently. All his siblings are in government custody, whereabouts unknown. His mother lives with her significant other and plans for marriage. She is a professional. She's hearing impaired and has a history of physical abuse. Mother is very, very committed to Stephen. His developmental history has been kind of pieced together, frankly. He has possible exposure in utero to drug and alcohol. He has, as I said, multiple surgeries. He had very limited sensory early in his early environment. He didn't run until the age of 5.5. In preschool, he was transferred after 3 weeks due to aggression and dysregulation. And his IQ at the time has been tested around, I think it's 84, with a little scatter. His history is one of severe neglect and abuse, significant sensory deprivation. At one point there was an introduction of testosterone to stimulate phallic growth, which increased his aggression, and he was hospitalized due to that. He is no longer on that. He has had multiple hospitalizations, both for medical and psychiatric. I was counting it up yesterday. I think the mental health placements in hospitals is up to like 6. He does have ongoing endorsement of auditory hallucinations, both past and present. There is a history of suicidal ideation. He has a very fragile ego. There is a history of sexually acting out. Trauma is clear from everything you've heard, I'm sure. There is significant deprivation. We recently found out that he was living on a unit in the orphanage where there was essentially no language with all the children on that particular unit. There is some concerns, Stephen has mentioned possible sexual abuse, but we'll not talk about that any longer at this time. There is significant loss and ongoing medical complications. The diagnoses have been far and wide. Clearly, he presents with PTSD, a rule out for PDD, a rule out to dissociative disorder, NOS, rule out for schizophrenia with command hallucinations, rule out ADHD, and a rule out reactive attachment. So that's a little bit of a history of Stephen. I think what's been most important to me, those of us at Stetson that know Stephen well, we see an abundance of hope for this little guy. He is, as I said, resilient and happy. My goal initially was working towards really normalizing relationships. And Mother, it is important to say, has been very focused on reactive attachment theory. Throughout his stay here, I've been working with her to look at how his presentation is oftentimes informed by the trauma that he has. She still continues to focus somewhat on the homicidal rage that she feels is a part of his attachment to her, so we've really been working on that. Stephen has stabilized quite well here, so that's a little bit of our information. So my 2 issues that I have been bringing up for discussion with both Steve and David is our approach, as well as, you know, the difference that I'm coming from this trauma-based theory and Mom is more reactive attachment. He's been here for a number of months now, and we're looking at as well as how can we more fully facilitate his returning home when he still struggles with an increase in dysregulation when he is around Mom.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Sally. I think the piece that to me is so remarkable is how you and everybody at Stetson have hold out that sense of hope for him. And I just want to say that for other, we're going to have both David and first David and then Steve comment on this case. And for those in the audience, if you have any questions, please type them in, and we'll try to get to as many of those as we can. So thank you, Sally, for that really wonderful presentation of this case. And David, I'm going to turn this over to you now.
Sure. Joan, actually, were we going to have Steve talk first? Or?
Oh, you're right. We were going to have Steve talk first. So
no worries.
Sorry about that. Steve, how about you? Can you make a comment then?
Yeah, sure. First of all, Sally, I think, because we've talked about this a little bit with you in advance of the consultant arm, but, this is a very, very challenging kid. I mean, he probably has the DSM diagnosis of RMO 2.2, which is really messed up, But when you try to put yourself inside of this kid and look at his life and look at what challenges he's facing, it is not at all surprising that he's acting out. It's more surprising that he's resilient enough be still having hope and willing to, and is growing in your program. I think the most interesting thing for me is, you know, given that he's in a residential program specializing in work with sexually abusive youth, sort of what model do you follow with a child like this? And I think it brings up a lot of thoughts, because, you know, the tendency might be to say we need to focus on getting his sexual acting out under control and perhaps use a manualized approach, or you know, some kind of cognitive approach, if you would. But this is a prime example of a developmental perspective where we have to work from the bottom up. I mean, that's the way the brain develops. That's the way kids develop. And so the whole idea that you started with, let's make him safe, let's make his day predictable, let's begin to develop certain kinds of relationships where he can trust that adults are not going to hurt him. And the one thing you didn't mention is that I think this parent not only sees him as rad, but is following one of those approaches where you have to force the rad attachment, which I'm so adamantly opposed to personally. I know some parents will swear by that, but I don't think you can force people to connect and relate. So I think that your approach of really understanding the trauma, understanding the profound nature of the medical history here for a boy, understanding his history of disrupted attachments at so many levels, and beginning to work with him from the ground up and say, at some point we will sort of get to the management and stabilization of his acting out behaviors is absolutely correct. And you're courageous to take him on, and I know that sometimes, you know, taking this approach can feel running counter to the conventional wisdom that we must focus on the sexual behavior, but I think you must focus on the complexity of who he is, and I think you are using a developmental approach, and I just applaud what you're doing.
Yeah, I actually want to respond to that. I think one of the things I'm most proud of us at Stetson is that it was really clear very early on that Stephen would benefit from grounding techniques, and we have a wonderful therapy dog that has been integral to his being able to stabilize. Being, you know, the therapy dog is with him when he's with his clinician. We have a woman here who works with the therapy dog, and it has morphed into working in family therapy. So that has been really a critical piece, along with the yoga that the clinician is doing.
And it's really great, and I think, you know, my challenge for him would be to make every day a more meaningful, happy, productive, safe day for him. You'll get to everything else, and his IQ level is high enough so you're not losing time, you know, in terms of waiting, but I think this approach really is what he needs.
Great. So I'd like to, two things. One is I've got the okay from Greg Day, who's our technical advisor, to try having everybody turn their webcams on so people can actually see you all talking as well. So if you could David and, thank you, you're there, David, and Steve and Sally each click on show your webcam. Sally, you look beautiful. Since I know
thanks for that.
You're concerned. So great, fabulous. So thank you. So this I hope will make it a little bit more interesting also for the audience. So so David, let me turn this over to you, and if you can give your thoughts about this case as well.
It is difficult to know exactly where to start with this. What I'm seeing on my screen right now is half of the diagnoses in the DSM all ruled out, with the exception of PTSD, which really just tells me after a certain point our diagnostic manuals are really quite limited, and that we should really just accept that and be okay with that. Sally, as you were talking also, the broader picture piece that comes to mind for me is that when we have one person being driven by their own theory saying, I think he's a rad kid, we need to treat the reactive attachment and everything else, or I think he needs cognitive behavioral therapy, we're missing the boat. And that all of us, when we first went to therapy school, as I like to call it, the first thing we learned was you meet the client where they're at. And in this case, we had some earlier discussions, and the motto that I've developed for Stephen is based on something that a fellow named Stephen Andrew once said in a training, which is we should meet our clients where they're at, but we should also meet them where they dream. And that for me, a big piece of doing this treatment, I think you've already captured, is understand the trauma, understand that a great deal of his life, and I suspect a lot of his mom's relationship with him, is in a kind of calcified and stuck state, and that this is a perfect example of where, you know, coming up with things like talk therapy or using words in treatment might actually be best saved closer to the end of treatment. You mentioned that he's doing yoga, and that's a personal favorite of mine. But I again want to say that really respecting that we should not be putting our models onto this kid. We should instead be figuring out what actually works for this kid. So as one person once observed, there's a real question of, are we manualizing persons, or are we personalizing the various manuals that we bring to work with us? So in terms of sort of mind-body work, I keep coming back to, it seems to me that the place to start with him is simply noticing what's going on in his body, simply noticing the physical sensations. It seems to me that this is a kid whose body hasn't been his own. It's been violated in a number of ways, some of which he's willing to talk about and some of which he's not. If it weren't for his sexual victimization, we could still be flabbergasted just by the amount of surgery that he's been through. So you know, if I were his therapist, I'd really just be emphasizing, where do you notice it when you sit in the chair? Do you notice it? You know, what's it like to sit in the chair? What part of the chair do you really? What do you feel? What's it like to stand up? What parts of your feet do you notice you tend to lean on? All of these kinds of things, just to get back to some sort of present moment experience, and not just present moment experience, but really the ability just to notice a present moment experience and then to make some kinds of decisions based on that experience independently. In other words, to practice making choices. Those would be the places where I'd start. I do have some thoughts about about Stephen's mother, but maybe I better hold off on those and see what thoughts others have first.
Great, thanks. And I noticed that we're getting some questions from the audience now too, and so so I'm wondering, maybe Sally, actually this might actually be more directed to you. It's just that, you know, when you mentioned earlier on that, you know, the mom doesn't quite agree with the therapist approach, there might be two slightly different approaches. The person said they're not clear about what the difference between a trauma-based approach and a reactive attachment approach. I wonder if you could maybe explain that a little bit, and I don't know if David or Steve, if you have any comments on that as well. So would you first, Sally? Yeah.
Technically, I think actually Steve will probably speak better to the reactive attachment. For me, as I said initially, what was most important, if I was to look overall at what my end goal would be for Stephen, would be that he felt safe in relationships. That we could meet him where he dreamed, and he was a young boy that just breathed life into relationships with us. It is a very different experience with Mom. Let me say that Mom does very strongly come from reactive attachment place. When she first came to us, I have to say also, when Mom first came to us, and did a little presentation on her son, it was very clear to me that without her support, I didn't know if we could be successful. Her commitment was huge. But along with her commitment, it was, this is the way that things have to be done relationally, that I am the one constant in his life, and people have to understand that the staff will be out of his life. And that felt really limiting to me. So that was the first place that Mom and I kind of had to meet to come up with, okay, what is our approach? And I felt supported enough in saying this. I felt supported enough in talking about trauma echoes, and I think our work together, I better informed her, but I think it is still something. Reactive attachment was very concrete for her, that whole program, and so to let go of it too much seems to be a really scary experience. I don't know, Steve.
Yeah, well, the one thing that I'd add is I don't want to speak about reactive attachment disorder in the abstract as opposed to the brand of it that this mother in particular was swayed was the best approach, which comes out of a very almost fringe element of how to work with RAD, which is, you know, that mom is the alpha dog, mom is the one person who can make decisions, everything has to be channeled through that, survival and everything has to be dependent, and therefore you're sort of the idea that you have to force the attachment. One, I don't think you can do that. Two, I think there are risks with that the more you try to force it, particularly if it runs against kids' difficulty with intimacy to begin with, you enhance those homicidal, angry feelings oftentimes and put yourself more at risk. I've seen that happen with other RAD kids going through these models. So I think it's not just, you know, what's the difference between RAD and trauma, because I've seen approaches with RAD kids that would be much more, you know, copacetic with trauma-based treatment, but this particular branch of RAD treatment, it isn't. And so I think it's a challenge for you. I'll also say that, you know, and this is happening to me whether I work with autistic kids or I work with RAD kids, what they are or aren't supposed to be able to do isn't always the case. As David points out, every kid is really unique. You don't know what his capability for attachment will be until you gradually and slowly explore it. You do have to be open to the fact that at his age he may not be able to get into an intimate, warm, close relationship with his, you know, adoptive mom, and may need something a little bit more at a distance. And as he starts to feel since so many people have abandoned him, that any of those feelings of closeness are going to be he's going to start acting out simply because I might as well get this over with. Everybody's going to abandon me as well, which makes work in a residential program sometimes a wonderful thing because you can explore relationships without that intensity of intimacy with any one person. So you know, once again, going back and not belaboring it, I think there are ways that certainly trauma and RAD work can go hand in hand. In this particular case, because of mom's perceptions of what she's supposed to do, they often diverge, and you're forcing things where you want to be gentle and soft and go on his timetable and not force anything. He's been forced to live a life that he wouldn't have chosen living all his life. You need to start making him feeling in charge of his own life right now and putting him back in control.
Can I just add one piece into this, which is when we think about diagnoses, I mean, a diagnosis is a category, and reactive attachment disorder is a category, and theories about it are a category. And it seems to me that what you've been doing a wonderful job of, Sally, is you're treating the components within these categories, and that maybe it's time to let go of the categories a little bit more and just talk about the components that make up Stephen.
That's great. That last question was from Mary Flanagan, and this next question is from Raymond Branton, and he asked, what would be some of the best objective assessment tools to help clarify diagnosis as well as risk assessment for youth his age? And David, I'm going to throw that to you first, because I know you've written actually a book that we carry, a couple of books that we've carried around risk assessment. So let's see. If it's worth people reading your books.
Sure. Oh boy, thank you, Joan. Okay, in 30 seconds. For risk assessment, I don't think that there is a proper tool that exists. I think that there's measures such as the J-SOAP or the eraser. They tend to begin applicability at the age of 12 or 13. Stephen is obviously such an unusual kid, and that the sort of, if you will, the base rate, I hate to sound technical, but the base rate of reoffense is also so low that that I'm not sure that there are many tools that could be used meaningfully. If I were to, I guess, if I were doing the assessment, I would want to be doing a very just comprehensive psychosocial assessment from for my purposes in terms of what can a residential treatment program be doing. Something else that I would want to do is probably figure out some, I'd want really comprehensive intelligence testing too, just looking at things like learning disabilities, and it sounds, Sally, like you've already got that that part figured out. And I'm really sorry if this sounds like a big plug for Penny's book, but I would, but it's the most obvious thing that comes to mind. I'd be looking at Penny Cunningham's book, The Brain Detective, which has some really helpful ideas for, so what do you do with, with somebody like Stephen that would help him gain access to education. Just returning to the risk assessment piece though, for me, it's like a series of hurdles. The first hurdle is you've got a very, very low base rate of reoffending. You've got a much higher likelihood of some sort of physical aggression, violence somewhere on down the road. And from there, then it's better probably to go straight to needs assessment to look at how can you strengthen the family relationships, how can you look at his sort of attitudes and beliefs about the way he carries himself in the world. And if I could only have one goal for Stephen, if I could only do one thing, it would be, can I get him to a place where he really feels competent with other people and can relate to them in some sort of meaningful and empathic way. If he were able to make changes in that area, I would say that his overall risk was to go down. But overall, I'm more concerned with sort of needs assessment and responsivity assessment than I am with risk assessment, since the overall risks at this point are pretty low. I hope that helps the person that asked the question.
It helps me.
Okay.
Also, I have to say, because, in our field, we are often asked, when are you going to do a risk assessment? And, I've gotten a lot of support, I have to say here, from our program director and from our executive director when I say, I'm not going to do one. I don't think it's appropriate. And they are very much in support of it. First of all, there are so many unknowns, and but it's nice again to get the validation from you folks, because it's one of those things that people often want to see, and it just has not seemed, from my perspective on Stephen, either ethical or appropriate.
Sure, and the bottom line also is that the risk, according to the research, is naturally low. It takes a lot of evidence to suggest otherwise, and that my answer to that would then be he's almost certainly low risk, but that also depends on what kind of an environment he's in. Right. So a lot of that's because he's 9 and highly dependent on his environment, as we all well know.
Sally, just to add one thing, I think a lot of times when people are asking for you to do a risk assessment, they really want you to do a risk prediction. Yeah. They really want you to predict what's the likelihood that this kid will reoffend, et cetera, et cetera. And, as David and I have talked many times, we're not very good at the risk prediction world. In fact, we ought to just forget all about risk prediction and talk about needs and responsivity and treatment plans and risk management. And what you can say about this kid is, if he has goals in his life, if he is happy, if he feels comfortable in his skin, if he gets his medical problems under control, and he has some kind of trusting relationship with adults, I guarantee you his risk drops significantly. And those are the challenges of treatment, not of what people typically say, tell me high, medium, or low risk, which to me means nothing. It's under what circumstances, where, and what environments, depending on what happens. David knows this much, much better than I do. But I think your idea of creating treatment plans that make sense is eminently more useful than trying to risk predict.
Okay, thank you, and welcome back, David.
Thanks.
So one thing that we talked. I think Sally, a little bit like as we were sort of thinking about, is this a case worth talking about? I know that one of the things that you brought up a lot was just really the role of the family here. And I think we've talked a lot about risk assessments and treatment, and I'm just sort of broadening that out because this is a unique situation for some, for some, and that you have him in a residential program, but at some point he'll be leaving. And just wondering, David, or maybe Steve first, maybe then David, just what are your thoughts about that transition, about involving family? What are some of the things to be thinking about now in terms of the family dynamics?
Well, my first thought is that you have this heavy orientation towards I need to be in control and in charge and not allow him to be who he is and just evolve organically. And wherever he is at a stage of when he leaves, he's still that sort of fundamental philosophical difference needs to be bridged to some degree. And so I'd be working a lot with the family now to say, look at how he's doing. These are things he never could do before, and this is the approach we're using. And, this is hard to get a family who's been trained by rad people who are professionals that you need to do this, and this is the only way this kid is going to get better. Well, what's happening in Stetson stands in contrast to that model already. So I think, to some degree, we want to engage Mom in his process within Stetson. And I know that, you're also, I think you said something about every time he goes home, he acts out more. If I'm remembering right.
Yeah, early on, he's not going home right now.
Yeah,
so
right. The answer was, as kids often do, they vote with their feet. I mean, he didn't got to say what's going on, but he's saying what's going on by his acting out. So something's not working. David, you might be able to speak much better to the specifics of how you would engage this family to try to get them on the same wavelength, but I think it's really critical that somehow this sort of general orientation of I'm going to make you be different, and this is how I'm going to do it, has to sort of shift a bit.
As I was listening to Steve talk, the piece that I might add into that is not only look at all of the amazing gains that this kid has made, but also I'd be interested to know, and how can the family really use these gains in their daily life? How can Mom really honor the progress that he's made, and the things that he's gotten good at? How can she employ them and put them to good use? That was just that was one thought that I had. We discussed this sometime in the past, and what keeps coming back to me is this sort of sense of stuckness. Oh my gosh, what am I going to do with my kid when he does get out of there? And although I think we're all really good at this, my inclination is to really see what can we do to make sure that Mom is feeling heard and totally understood and totally respected, and maybe spending a little more time there than we professionals might really think is necessary. Our friend and colleague Joanne Schladel always puts it best when she says the slower you go, the faster you get where you're going. And I actually heard an interesting spin on that. In Russia, apparently, there's a saying that the slower you go, the further you can reach. And so that might be another way to look at it. Things that really came through as I was reading about the mother in the materials that you sent earlier, where on the one hand, she really, really wants to be the best mother that she can be. And on the other hand, I'm sure that part of her would just really like to be done with all of this and to have things get better. All right, that she really wants to love him with heart and soul. And on the other hand, she's not always sure what to do with him. And that, on the one hand, she really wants to be able just to accept him for who he is and how he functions. And on the other hand, a lot of his behavior, especially the homicidal pieces, are really unacceptable. And on the one hand, she understands that the sexual misconduct can be a real passing phase. And yet, on the other hand, we all worry maybe that this is something that would be happening again in the future. And that, and finally, that on one hand, she's really hoping for a better future, and yet on the other hand, she's not so sure what to expect. And these are just horrible places for any parent to be. Sally?
I recently I've realized that when you talk about meeting Stephen where he dreams, it's important for us to recognize where Mom dreams. And I have been so impressed by her conviction, her, but the bottom line is she had a dream of what we all fantasize, and as parents we all know doesn't really exist. The perfect child, everything just easy, and I want to be a mom. And she found when she arrived at the orphanage a young boy with very complicated issues. And she loves that boy. But she has not yet been able to mourn that vision of her dream of what it is to be this mother in this, what we all hold, So I don't begrudge her that. But I realize right now we have to meet her where she is, because I think that's her struggle currently, actually. Because as I said earlier, we see Stephen as this boy with lots of hopes. It's complex. He recently, Steve, you were talking a little while ago about relationships, and another boy on his unit left. And it was another loss for him. But those of us didn't quite think ahead, oh, this is going to have an impact on Stephen. But Stephen let us know that this was difficult. There was a burst, but nothing compared to what you might have thought. We processed it through it. And so, our hope was, just enlivened again. But Mom is still struggling and is still mourning and doesn't see a lot of change. So, I think that's where we're at right now, is to be able to meet her where she is and help her, sort of move in the direction that, with the possibilities with Stephen.
I guess you could use a phrase, if Mama ain't changing, ain't nobody changing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sally, I think you get the challenge of the process. I think this happens with a lot of parents who go and decide to adopt these really complicated, difficult kids. They really in some ways believe that if they love the child enough and they just provide this safe, wondering, rich, meaningful environment and resources and all, that that they can heal these kids. And the healing process is just very complicated, and the kids make it difficult. And they deserve they're earning their angel wings on this one. And the other thing is that one of the things that parents learn is to celebrate small successes. I mean, you really do. You're not thinking about okay, we'll celebrate when he goes to Harvard and becomes a doctor. You're celebrating when he smiles at me and doesn't throw the plate at my head. So I think that teaching her to celebrate small, it's hard, and I think you get it. I mean, I'm telling you anything you don't know. I think you're on the right track with her, but there's so many ways. You're all experiencing the wonder of, wow, this kid didn't kill himself this morning, given what he's bearing. He's got so much resilience. He's got humor. He's got athleticism. He's got all these things to celebrate. And the more that she can celebrate that rather than his acting out behavior, and the fact that he's with you means that she's not bearing the brunt of a daily acting out, which is almost exhausting for any parent to see beyond. I just cannot tolerate the behaviors anymore. It's driving me crazy. It takes a saint not to get to the point of saying, I got to be done with this. So you have a window here when she's not bearing the brunt of having to manage him, when maybe she can learn more to celebrate with you, and maybe that's something to think about a bit.
Great, thank you. And so I don't know if you were reading the questions, but that actually really directly answered a really wonderful question from Myra Altonow. Randy Cook, who actually is one of our sponsors with Rancho Erlo, had asked if you could maybe, and Dave, I think this is what you started, was please expand on the grounding techniques that can be helpful with emotional regulation.
Sure. And actually, Joan, could I just also interject? I'm also still back at the risk assessment question, and just want to say, obviously, everybody on this webinar is really concerned about sexual misbehavior, and nobody wants to see anybody being sexually abused. And that I think one of the undercurrents of this entire conversation is that if you're taking care of Stephen's emotional development, that alone will have a very powerful and dramatic effect on his overall risk. So I don't want to seem as if I'm sweeping the risk pieces under the rug, but I am saying that there's an indirect way to get there. So I thought that would be worth mentioning. I'll say really quickly about the grounding techniques that part of the problem with cognitive behavioral therapy is that it, as many of us know, can get really, really cognitive really quickly. And we forget about just sort of present moment experience. Now, I don't want to sound sort of hokey and, you know, mindfulness is everything. But I will say that as therapists and as programs, I anticipate that Sally is under very fierce pressure to reduce risk, to get documentation done. We can all get moving really, really quickly. We hear a lot about the importance of slowing down and grounding, and a couple of simple things in my world that really help is reminding therapists simply to lower their shoulders, to relax, to slow their breathing down just a little bit before every session. And that when the client comes in a somewhat anxious state, match your breath to them, slow your own breath down. These are good places to start. We hear a lot about mindfulness and sort of examining the present moment. That's good. We hear a lot about meditation, which is also good, but that tends to be a lot about focusing as well. I mean, you might focus on a thought, focus on a stone, focus on your breath, focus on this or that or the other thing. With Stephen, I'm just thinking mostly about what's come to be known as interoception, just examining what's happening inside your body. Sally talked about yoga. I'm a yoga teacher myself. I love yoga. A lot of times yoga gets misunderstood as let's twist our bodies into a pretzel and try to balance on our pinky or whatever else, levitate across the floor, etc. And really what I'm talking about is using yoga simply as a place to notice perhaps what it's like to stand on the ground, the intensity that comes to your stomach muscles when you maybe lean back in a chair and lift your feet off the floor. Just anything that happens with physical sensations. And I usually tend to think of it simply in a sentence of, as you do this, you may notice some sensations here, or you may notice it someplace else. The other thing that I like about this kind of sort of physical grounding and physical or attention to physical processes is that if somebody like Sally or a yoga teacher is doing it with somebody like Stephen, they're literally physically aligned, that they're physically attuned. And we talk a lot about empathy, but before you can have empathy, you're going to have some kind of attunement. And that probably that's the best place to start, because when we try to get to empathy too fast, let me just say very quickly and then I'll stop, is that empathy on its own can be a dangerous thing to a traumatized kid. Many people have used empathy as a tool for trauma, as a means to get close to people and then hurt them. So increasingly, I'm about attunement, paying attention to physical experience, and compassion, and being a little bit careful with empathy. Sorry, did that answer the question, Joan?
I think that's great.
Joan, could I ask and add a couple of things to that?
Because I'm moving towards wrap-up, so if you can do it real quickly, Steve.
Yeah, I will. I think there are sort of bins around that. I mean, one is just talking to him a lot about what makes him feel better. Does he like to walk around? Does he like to run? Does he like to use his body? What quiets him down? And usually residential staff figure that out over time without asking anything. He just gets quieter when he does certain things. Does he like to learn to listen to music? With biofeedback, neurofeedback, alpha stim, any of these things help him quiet down. Those are the neurological interventions. There are exercise programs. There, all of what David said as well. Just finding, there's also sensory tools too. It's finding out, does he like weighted blankets? Does he need deep pressure? Does he need those kinds of things? And it's an exploratory process with every kid to find out what makes you feel better and what calms you down when you're dysregulated.
Great, thank you, Steve. And so I just want to ask maybe each of you if you could give just a short, 1 minute, sort of what you see sort of the takeaway on that for people maybe who joined in late, or just like what would be the one thing that you feel like is really important for people to remember about a case just like this, and what maybe you took away from this particular web consultanar. So, Sally, I want to start with you.
Yeah, I'm glad you did, because I think the most important thing is in listening to this is that there's still a lot of joy in our field. There's still a lot of thinking, and there's no one prescribed way. I think it was really important when David said, we're not minimizing that we have to look at risk. It's just that, when I first started in this field, it was, we look only at the behavior of sexual offending. We don't look at the trauma. We don't look at anything else. And now it's, let's look at every possibility. Let's bring in, it is really validating for me to hear Steve and David talk about the things we're doing here, and that in my heart, my hope is that we're getting to where all our kids at Stetson want to be. But we're still oftentimes faced with that pressure from our providers saying, what's the risk level, or what exactly are you doing? And so it's important to me that we get into the mainstream the kinds of language that we use today, that we're talking, that everybody's thinking about mindfulness, that it's not just about one thing or another. It's really looking at the complexity of our work matching the complexity of the children. So this felt
great.
really validating.
Thank you. And Steve, how about what's your one takeaway?
Probably the one takeaway is we so much want to get to sort of making better choices. And choices is a cognitive process that really is built on being regulated, period, so that you're not totally out of control and really not making choices. You're acting before you even think and make choices. And so the whole idea of developmental approaches to these kids, of starting at the bottom up, starting with the level that they're at, whether it's dysregulation because their amygdala is firing and they're traumatized and it's done before they can think about it, whatever it is, using the entire toolkit, things we haven't even thought of yet, being creative, bringing that to the table to say, let's work with this kid from the bottom up. We will get to the choices level when he's capable of being able to really make choices and control himself, but don't be frightened to deal developmentally.
Great, thank you. And David?
It's really simple. My big takeaway is just the importance of connection, of having a heart as well as a head, and having some action that we can do. So connection with Mom, connection with Stephen, I think these are really, really key ingredients. And the only other thing I'm going to say is big high five, Sally. You can be my therapist anytime. So thank you for this case.
Great.
Thank you for your help.
Yeah. Well, and I just want to say that really that it's really quite wonderful that that all of you have you just have contributed to such a rich discussion today. So really, I want to just take a quick minute to say that for people who are on the webinar today, that if you're interested, that we are starting a new library that you can take advantage of and sort of get basically all 4 of these books, which has a value of, if you bought each individually, over around $250, but we're selling them for $189. And these are 4 wonderful books, Current Perspectives and Current Applications, which are edited by David and Rob Longo, and really wonderful compendium of articles, as well as to an international perspective, The Current Practice of Young People, edited by Martin Calder. Also linked with the book about prevention. So I want to just let you know that this is available on our website, or you can call the toll-free number for NEARI Press. But that in addition to this, just that there's want to just go through here and just say also that we have a number of upcoming webinars still, that if you, still this month, we're also on March 18th, there'll be the Brain Detective with Penny and Shannon, who are both from NEARI as well, from the NEARI School. In April, we have Robert Kinshrift talking about developmental perspective, and Keith Kaufman talking in May about the prevention source book. All of these are books which are published through NEARI. I also want to take a moment to thank our series sponsors. And as I said earlier, we really could not be doing these free services without the sponsors that have contributed so generously to making this happen. The United Methodist Family Services, St. Joseph's Orphanage, James Reynolds, Central New York Psychiatric Center, the Durham Family Court Clinic, the Center for Clinical and Forensic Services, the ITM Group, and Ranch Arlo Society. To be a sponsor, it costs $250 for an organization, and your whole staff can sign on for free, and we will guarantee you a spot. And for individuals, it's $98. And we do send you copies of a current perspectives and current applications. So it's a wonderful sort of win-win situation for all of us. And last, I just want to say thank you. Thank you certainly for everybody who participated today in our audience and for the great questions. I'm sorry we didn't get a chance to get to all of them. But I also want to say a special thank you for Sally for presenting such a rich case and for opening up to such a great discussion. I agree with David. You would be the place I would send my kid, absolutely. And thank you, David and Steve, both for your really wonderful insights and perspectives. So thank you. And again, please, to everybody in the audience, be sure to sign off so that you can fill in the feedback form. And again, thank you, David, thank you, Steve, and thank you, Sally, for participating in this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, thanks.
Great. All right, bye, everybody.
All right, bye.